Hi everybody, welcome to Chapter 1, or the first part of our Oklahoma School Boards Association view of how they deal with the accounting system. This is going to be a fairly unique way to look at school finance and school accounting because Oklahoma's book presents us more from a legal perspective than it does from what principals should know about school budgeting and school finance. So reading this, understanding it, I don't know, this isn't, the easiest way I guess I can put it is, this isn't a fun book to read. The other two books, I actually think there's like enjoyable topics and enjoyable content in them. You can sit down, you could actually read them, you could learn something, and you could actually apply it. This book is basically just a list of laws of what you can and can't do. Because of that, I've tried to make it into a slideshow that highlights in two parts the stuff that pertains specifically to building principles. That's what matters, that's what I think is important, and I think what's going to benefit you in the context of a building level finance class. So you have this book in front of you that you shouldn't get rid of because it is all of the state laws for Oklahoma and according to the School Board Association. But that being said, there's only going to be certain things that relate to as a building principle, and I will probably have to do about 5 or 6 of these when I'm doing the district level finance class because the stuff is much more pertinent at that level. So I've only highlighted what I think is important, and based off of that, we're going to go through this. This is a rather long lecture, but we'll go through this one at a time, and I'll make sure I'll explain to you in terms of how they approach it. This lecture is just a lot of facts, but there's really not much else to add to it because if you've looked at the book, all it is facts. But the facts I highlighted are important facts, and when you take your midterm, your final exam, you'll have access to all this, which I think will help you perform better, and then you have the PowerPoints where I've pulled most of the important stuff. So, I do want to mention too that another challenge is that all of you have more Oklahoma experience than I do. This is new to me, this is a new context. The book doesn't read well unless you're from Oklahoma. So it's one of those things where if you're in a school system and you're in an organization that's using these finance practices, you'll understand them better. But this is the only, this is one of 2 lectures that I'm doing in this course that's really Oklahoma specific. So it's up to you on how you take the facts and interpret them and use them in your own educational organizations. So one of the things that I thought was actually important from the book that I think it's worth saying is that the book notes that you learn this material through being in a position where you practice it, not through being a school administrator. And that's, not from being somebody in classes to learn how to be a school administrator. I think that's important because this is when you're actually going to learn this material and understand it better. So that being said, we have this uniform documentation that's consistent across the state. It's what's expected in Oklahoma, and you should be learning it and using it as a future school administrator. So, the big idea in the book is the idea of activity funds, basically because it's one of the things that can be easily fraudulent in schools, and that they're going to present a different perspective than all the other textbooks are because this is the Oklahoma specific laws for activity funds. So I'll present and highlight for you what I feel is sort of the important things that are involved in their perception of what you need to be doing as a building leader in terms of activity funds. So this is important. Income can be there are certain incomes that can be placed in activity fund accounts. So it's only stuff that is listed on here. We're looking at different types of organization operations, different types of things like concessions, school events, stuff like that, but note everything that can be placed into activity fund accounts, and that's fairly important. So the big idea that they stress multiple times is that general fund money cannot be placed into the activity fund, but general fund refund accounts and petty cash, it can go from there, from the general fund to the activity funds. But any money that's given to a school for general funding cannot be placed into the activity fund. So we spoke about petty cash earlier in the course, and I kind of presented for you more of a holistic view of it, but now we have what's law in our state. It's important to note that you cannot spend more than $75 on one item from petty cash, and the fiscal year expenditures for the building cannot be more than $2,500 per building. That's important to note because I think of a petty cash fund about something as simple as, buying donuts for the teachers one day in the morning for a job well done, buying pizza after school for the teaching staff. Well, if you have a large teaching staff, those transactions might be more than $75, so you're going to have to get approval from your higher ups in order for you to do things like that. So $75 is the limit for expenditures that you can have. So if a student destroys school property, the board can access the activity fund account and use that to replace. And that can be done for summer school tuition and adult education as well. So if it comes out of a student's responsibility, that can be refunded within the activity fund account and replaced there as well. So if a student activity is being used to raise funds to improve a curricular program, so I thought about this for a while and I really didn't get where this, where you would be doing this, and the only thing that I could think of was art and music, because you would be using the money you made in the activities to buy better supplies, better uniforms, better instruments, something like that. Then the money that was in the activity fund, the general fund, can supply it. So what I'm guessing this means is, let's say the activity fund has money in it, and it has $8,000 in it, and the school district wants to provide all new trumpets for the marching band. Well, they can spend the activity fund money to do that, and then the general fund money can replace it in the activity fund, and then the purchase of the trumpets aren't the students or the activities, they become the school's property. So that's the only real exception involved in this, but it only has to be done if it's improving a curricular program. So it would have to be something that's both an extracurricular and curricular. And the only two examples I could think of that relate for this are art and music. You might come up with something different, but in terms of my experience, those were the only real examples I could come up with. So the general fund can't be used to bail out an activity account with a negative balance. If the activity fund runs out of money, then the sponsor and the building principal have to find a way to support or maintain the activity, or they can just let it go. So petty cash and refund accounts close out at the end of the year. Activity funds roll over as long as the activity is alive in the school organization. Activity funds can be transferred to other activities with the school board approval. And what I've seen occur with this is if a district decides not to sustain a particular activity due to limited interest and lack of involvement, and they have a fund balance, what most districts will do is they'll evenly divide up the disbursement, and then they'll give it to each other activity. So that's permitted as long as the board approves it. So there isn't a limit to how many activity accounts exist. That shouldn't surprise anybody. Activities can receive donations, which is interesting. As long as the money that the activity is given is being used for a charitable purpose, then the activity can receive as much money as there's no limit to it. And I think that's interesting as well. There isn't a limitation on spending. If the activity fund wants to spend an infinite amount of money, they have the right to. That is not regulated at the state, district, or building level. The activity has the autonomy to spend what they want. And obviously their process different than general funds. I think that goes without saying. So in our state, the board does have autonomy over activity fund accounts and fundraising activities. So the board will get to establish that, and then you as the building principal have to facilitate that within the course of the activities. So the board has the responsibility to approve every fund account and every fundraising activity. Basically what that means is that if an organization wants to create a new fundraising activity, it has to go to the building principal level, get approval, and then the building principal has to push it through to the school board, and the school board will approve of that fundraising activity by vote. Why this matters is that this can take time to get established and time to accomplish. So we might have we might have fundraising problems. Basically, if the funds need to be created by May, you go to the principal in October, the board doesn't get around to approving it until January, you've lost about 3 months where you could be raising funds. But the purposes of this are the fact that the board needs to make sure that there is an overlap in what you're trying to fundraise for versus what another organization is trying to fundraise for. So that's why they do it this way and why the school board approves these accounts and what the expenditures are. So if there's an emergency, the school board can tell the school administrators they can make the priority and they can approve it, and then they have to vote on it at the next school board meeting. So some other school board responsibilities related to activity funds. These are all things that you can basically look in the book for any specifics if you want them, but there's a list provided that goes over each one the school board has the responsibility to do, and they have the right to do if they so desire to. So the board can purchase bonds for all employees in the district to basically protect from improper action by the activity sponsors. So basically what this will do, let's say the Band Boosters has a cash balance of $58,000 and the activity sponsor decides they want to run off with the money. If that occurs and the board purchased a bond that protects, that refunds the money, and it refunds from potential embezzlement from occurring. So that's kind of a big idea and something that the board has the right to do, but obviously, we spoke about this earlier in the class, purchasing bonds cost money. So if you want to purchase a bond, that's great, but it's still going to cost the district money in the first place. So one of the things that I think is worth noting is that in larger school districts, there should be and there can be a finance manager that's in charge of handling these things. Your smaller districts, and as you know from the context in this state, there's a lot of smaller districts throughout the state, meaning that the building principal or the superintendent essentially is the finance manager. District size matters. That makes a difference as to what you're going to do with this funding, because if the finance manager is the one that's in charge of it, they will have a direct connection with the school board, meaning you go as the building principal to the finance manager, everything gets done through that channel. But if the district doesn't have it, you might be the one as the building principal going to the school board directly, which in itself could create some challenges as well. So I give you a list of what most principals do with activity funds. You can read that on your own. I'll give you a minute to do that. Okay, so what does the activity custodian do? They have the responsibility for basically being the person that supervises the money and where it goes in the activity. This can be the building principal, it can be another employee that's associated with the district, it could even be a school board member. It depends on the district and it depends on the way that they want to establish the system. The big thing that they're doing, they're controlling the accounts where the activity money is coming, and if the board authorizes an advancement, they're providing a disbursement as well. So some additional things that the activity custodian does. One of the things that I would want to notice and say what they do, they prepare a monthly report of each account. I kind of think that's important and worth mentioning because as we looked in Money in Schools, we saw that they suggested a weekly account or a bi-weekly account for money disbursement, but in this particular case, the activity custodian does a monthly report, and that's what's required in the state of Oklahoma. So, a timely manner. I could define that differently than you do, and other districts could. But the challenge with this is the way that the Oklahoma School Boards Association says a timely manner occurs. It's that activity funds have to be deposited no later than the next business day. unless the deposits total less than $100. If the deposits are less than 100 and there were deposits, then they have to be done weekly. So if there's any major deposits or any major disbursements, that has to be done by the next business day. If not, then it's done on a weekly basis. So the custodian has the responsibilities to create the deposit slip. They have to make sure that they have receipts that back up what's being deposited. But most importantly, they have to show the date the money was received, who remitted the money, why the activity fund is spending or obtaining money, and how the funds were received and to whom. That's really the responsibilities they have, but it relates to everything we've been saying throughout this course. Fiscal transparency and transparency in general is the key. If you document everything and you have the proper signatures, you should be fine on this. So, gate collection. This is a big deal in Oklahoma because a lot of money will come in through athletic events and individuals going to athletic events, and it's a responsibility that supplies and promotes the activity fund in the school athletic program. Anytime that there is a gatekeeper that is selling tickets, they have the responsibility to keep the numbers of how many tickets were actually sold. They have to write a written reconciliation at the end of the event so that they can show that the revenues match the tickets that were sold. And then they suggest that 2 gatekeepers should actually audit and approve this for every event that's attended at the school level. So I give you a list of what the site secretaries do. I think this image really shows a lot of what your secretaries do because they wear every single hat and have a million hands and they're responsible for a lot of different things. But the site secretaries have a lot of responsibilities that they have to do. So other employees, other teachers, they have the list of there's another list of what they are permitted to do as well. Main thing that we need to stress on here is that they submit everything that they need in terms of purchase forms or deposits to the proper administrator, and they have to make sure that there is approval for any purchase done by the administration. If there's not, that can create a problem as well. So I really think that's the big idea, but once again, I'm repeating myself, this all comes back to transparency. You have to make sure that there's an accountability piece in place and you're being transparent with everything that you do. So there was a list in the book that I thought was interesting. These were activity fund deficiencies noted by the state auditor that happened throughout school districts. I keep saying this over and over again, but activity funds are going to be an area where a lot of your problems and challenges happen as a building principal, so that's something that you have to keep in mind. But this just gives you a list of what the state auditor found were specific deficiencies in activity funds. So, booster clubs. We're going to kind of look at the policy on the next slide of this, but we mentioned this briefly when we were looking at money in schools. Students, if the organization is operated by adults, it's an adult organization. If it's a student organization, then it's processed through activity funds. They're student activity funds, but it still falls under the general procedure of activity funds. So, this is a state law in the state of Oklahoma that shows what groups are not subject to board control and activity fund management. So this is important to note because these are some of the organizations that could be present in your school and they could be working from there as well. So those are the big ideas for activity funds. you have to be transparent with it, understand that the board has control over it, but there's a few more big takeaways from this section that I think is important.